This is an ease event, part of our regular series of monthly member webinars. We have a spring and an autumn series, and we pick one session from each of those series to be free and open event. And this session on GPT AI tools is our free spring series. So welcome everyone if you're joining us for your first ease event. We have a series of different kinds of events that we run at ease. This is our monthly member webinar. Our regional chapters also host open webinars as well as their own chapter member only events. We also run a series of multi-part training sessions for members and non-members. Our next training event is the editorial school for journal editors, which begins on the 1st of June alongside the conference. Our major biennial conference will be held at the end of this month in Istanbul, Turkey, and online from the 1st to the 3rd of June. Mary will drop the link in the chat for everyone. So registrations for the conference are open. There's a range of rates and discounts available for the main event itself and satellite workshops, the editorial school with Pippa Smart, and an publication ethics workshop with Vivian Bachelet. And they're both running alongside the conference. And EASE members also make sure you register for the AGM, our association meeting on the 1st of June, for detailed updates from EASE and the results of our council voting. The new council will be announced at that session, so I'm very, very excited, looking forward to that. Before I hand over to Avi to take us through the main event, some little bit of brief housekeeping. So I see everyone is already introducing yourselves in the chat. Fantastic. Keep those comments coming. If you have any comments throughout the session, observations or anything you want to mention, please enter them in the chat. If you have any specific questions for our speakers, please put them into the Q&A box in the Zoom interface at the bottom of the screen on desktop. I'm not exactly sure where it is on mobile. And I'll collate all those questions and put them to our speakers at the end of the session. Feel free to share screenshots and comments and observations about this session on social media using the hashtag EaseEvents and our handle at EaseEditors, which is the same on all our different platforms. The session will be recorded, or is being recorded now, will be recorded and made available on our YouTube channel. We'll share the link with you afterwards, but it'll be one of our public videos on the EASE channel. And also at the end of the session, during the Q&A, we'll post a link to a feedback form as well about the session. So we would appreciate your comments afterwards about what you thought. So we have several open webinar recordings available for public view on our YouTube page, along with several other information videos and bits and pieces from various EASE activities, plus some new poster presentations in advance of our conference poster exhibition. And EASE members can access our member-only webinars, plus a lot of other specially curated documents and resources on our resources database and the EASE website. And now that is quite enough from me. Didn't come here today to hear me talk. So let's start our main event. Hand you over to our guest speakers for today, Avi Staiman and Phill Jones.
Brilliant. And Duncan, anytime you want to speak, I will be there in the audience. So not to worry. Really an honor and a pleasure to be here, to have all of you join us today. Any event that manages to get together over 100 folks on Zoom, it's a sign that it's something that's really important on people's minds, and clearly something that we're all trying to grapple with together. And I think there's maybe no one better than Phill Jones to discuss this. In fact, some of my early thinking about AI was really kind of formed by his presentation. And he's going to be giving sort of what I would call as a bird's eye overview of GPT, AI, how it works, what we should be looking out for in terms of potential pitfalls, but also opportunities. And then if you stick around afterwards, I'll be discussing some of the actual use cases within academic research that can make it very tangible, real. And if I imagine that many of you are thinking about policy, hopefully will help to start formulate some thinking around, well, how do we develop policy around our journals, and what should that look like, and really cater it and personalize it to your journals. I also want to mention before we get started here that I'm honored to be the ease representative for a big group of folks who are coming together through the Equator Network, including representatives from AAAS, WAME, EASE, and COPE, which are basically, as well as editors-in-chiefs and senior editors of top journals, who are all going to be part of a committee to try and hammer out some policy and some ethics directions and guidelines around the use of AI tools within academic research, so that it's not necessarily up to each and every individual journal to do it on their own, but actually there's some kind of higher thinking going on, and trying to get everyone in the room, everyone that's relevant to this conversation. So I will try to report back as much as I can about kind of how these things are progressing, and welcome any input or any resources that you may have. Feel free to drop me a line. Always really interested in hearing what you think and what you have to say. And then finally, at the end, we will conclude with the Q&A, as Duncan mentioned. So without further ado, just quickly, a little bit about Phill. Phil's a former physicist who turned into publishing executive, technologist, and consultant. As a researcher, he worked at the UK Atomic Energy Authority and Harvard Medical School. He was an early employee of the Journal of Visualized Experiments, or JOVE, and spent 6 years at Digital Science in both outreach and innovation roles. He is one of the co-founders of the More Brains Cooperative, a publishing, scholarly communications, and infrastructure consulting firm that, among other things, helps publishers develop future-proof innovation and technology strategies. Phill, I hand the microphone over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Avi, and thank you very much, Mary and Duncan and the folks at EASE for inviting me to speak, and of course everybody who's here. It's really great to see so many folks. I think we're up to 112 participants now, so that's really encouraging. It's clearly a topic that lots of folks are interested in. Okay, so now I should be sharing my screen, and you all ought to be able to see it. So as Avi said, my talk is going to be a bit of an introduction, if you like, or a primer into almost what's going on under the hood with these large language models. I think it's really important to get a sense, not necessarily too deep a dive into the mathematics of it or anything like that, but just a sense of what the mechanics are of how things work, because then it's easier to get a grasp of what the opportunities are, what the limitations are, and what the risks are. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how these things are, can be applied and are currently being applied, or maybe in the future. All right, so who's behind GPT? So it was a company called OpenAI that was founded in 2015, and you can see there's some big names there behind the original founding of it. Around 2018, 2019, there was almost, it feels like a little bit of a change in perspective from them. Elon Musk exited, and they changed into a transition into a capped for profit organization. That allowed them to bring in more money, more investment, and crucially, they partnered with Microsoft. I think there's been a little bit of a push and pull throughout their history since then, between their role almost as researchers into AI and the opportunities and the threats and the challenges that it poses, and the desire to sort of make a profit out of it, and to monetize it and to leverage the technology. It's evolved over the years. It's gone through several iterations, the most famous of which is, of course, ChatGPT, and that's the one that started all the excitement and all the hype sort of last year. But there are other versions, other products that they've released that are really important. There is an API version of GPT, and GPT-4 has been released this year. And there's also a version of it which is tuned to computer code, or trained with computer code, called Codex, which forms the basis of a bunch of tools that help developers write code more easily, particularly the GitHub Pilot sort of use cases for it started to really strongly emerge last year, I think, in things like journalism and marketing copy and that sort of thing. All right, so that's sort of a potted timeline, if you like, of where GPT came from. It's important to note that other large language models and other AI projects exist out there. They're not the only one, just the most famous. All right, so how does GPT in particular work? So you may have heard this term stochastic parrot, or you may have heard this idea that all it's actually doing is predicting the next word to come out. It's almost like an auto-completion exercise, if you like. So how does it do that? Well, one might sort of think from a brute force point of view, how could you achieve this? Let's imagine this sentence here. The best thing about AI is its ability to. Now, you can break that up into a series of tokens. Now, for tokens, think words. The reason we say tokens is because there are other things like acronyms, numbers, punctuation, that sort of thing that make up language. But basically, it's sort of words, really. So if you went through a bunch of text that have been written by humans, you go back through all the corpus, all the books that have ever been written, you would probably find somewhere those 9 words in that order somewhere. You might find lots of instances of that. And if you then looked at all of those instances, you could see what is the most common word to come after it. And that's essentially the thinking behind how you do large language models and how you do this sort of auto-completion thing. The challenge is that it's not quite so easy as that because there's a bit of a numbers problem. So if we processed a large enough amount of real human written text, you would find lots and lots of 2-word combinations, obviously. And these you could call 2-grams. The challenge is that there are about 40,000 commonly used words in English, which would make about 1.6 billion of these 2-grams. Now, if you think about 20 grams, that's 20 tokens or 20 words in a row, and you have 440,000 commonly used words in the English language, that's a larger number of combinations than there are particles in the universe. So if you've got a long piece of text and you're trying to find all of those tokens in a row, you're not going to be able to find them. There simply isn't enough text having ever been written, and it's computationally far too vast of a problem to solve anyway. So you have to figure out how to make a best guess. And that's where the neural network part of this comes in. So I'm not going to delve too far, so please don't be frightened by the equations and the complicated graph on here. Just to sort of simplify it as much as practically possible, what a neural network does is it takes a bunch of numbers in an input, so you feed it in a bunch of numbers, and then it passes that through what is essentially a very complicated equation or a very complicated function, and then it spits out a series of probabilities for what it thinks is the answer. And when you're training this, you may have heard this term training a neural network in the past. What happens is you start off with perhaps a random set of parameters within this neural network. So what these parameters are is for every node on the layer, so you look at that sort of hidden layer box there, and you've got a series of circles. For each one of these nodes, it takes a weighted average, a series of weights multiplied by the series of numbers in the previous layer. And then in each node, each circle going down is a different set of weights and a different set of averages. And so then when you change all of those weights, all of those parameters, you'll get a different set of numbers in the output, different set of probabilities in the output. And all you do when you're training it is you modify those until you find the best guess, the best result, the lowest difference between the guesses and the right answer across all of the possible input functions. And that's how it works. It basically just minimizes what they call the cost function. It works out what the answer is that is most correct. Now, if you want some more details about this, there's a great YouTube channel called 3 Blue 1 Brown, which goes into some, without going into too much sort of complexity, certainly breaks this down and makes it in a lot more detail than I'm able to go to in these time limitations. But all you need to know from this is that a neural network allows you to make a best guess from a complicated function with incomplete information. So that begs the question, that's very well for numbers. How does GPT apply this to words? Because this is a language model, not a number model. So what GPT does, and other large language models, is it does something called natural language processing. It takes sentences, it takes strings, and it breaks them up into various semantic chunks, and it parses them. So it's able to understand what the what the type of words things are, verbs, nouns, so on and so forth. It then looks at the blocks, the semantic functionality within the sentence, and it also looks at things like sentiment analysis, and it recognizes proper nouns. All of these things are ways that you can attach numbers or parameters to a particular string. What it also does, which is quite interesting, and it's one of the distinctive qualities of GPT and other transformer models, is that it has what's called a self-attention mechanism. It's a self-attention transformer model. And let's consider this sentence to understand what that means. So this sentence is, she is eating a green apple. Now, in that sentence, the word eating and green have a high self-attention with the word apple. What that means is they're important to that word. They are things about that word. Whereas to each other, green and eating, they're not important to one another. So there's a hierarchy, there's a semantic hierarchy within sentences and within paragraphs. And that's one of the things that GPT does. It parameterizes that type of dependency, that type of self-attention hierarchy. Now, what makes GPT as successful as it has been, and ChatGPT as convincing as it is that it has many more parameters than other previous models. That allows it to understand the relationships between words that are a long way away from each other in text. That's how it's able to generate text that's more coherent. It's how it's able to mimic certain styles of writing. That's what's been so. That's the characteristic that has underlined a lot of those incredibly impressive demonstrations and behaviors that you may have seen. Okay, so in summary, what we do is, in order to make a large language model, is you feed a lot of input data into the model. You break it down into a lot of tokens, and then you build a neural network which has, in the case of GPT-4, 100 trillion parameters, 100 trillion possible variables that can be changed. You train it over time to change all of those parameters, to minimize the error over all of the training data. And then the last thing you do is you do something called reinforcement learning, which is the human feedback mechanism. That's when you tell it to stop coming out with offensive language. That's when you tweak it in order to have particular use cases or characteristics or whatever that might be. And then once you've trained it, you've analyzed the things that have already been written, you can then use that same model with all its parameters all trained up and all ready to go to predict things that could possibly be written. You put your input text into it, and then you let it go through the network. It spits out the output text, and then for each new word that it needs, you then go back through and you iteratively cycle through that neural network, applying it iteratively so that you end up with that long string of text that can be thousands of words long and coherent and consistent, and appears at least to be make sense, or to plausibly be a good piece of writing, an understandable human readable piece of writing. Okay, so that's the hopefully not too technical, but hopefully sort of with enough depth to get a sense of what it is that's actually going on under the hood. So let's talk a little bit about these capabilities, which hopefully will now make a little bit more sense or be a little bit more intuitive. So I did a little bit of an experiment at the end of last year using ChatGPT. Now, as you're watching this, you might think, well, I didn't particularly prompt engineer these questions that I gave ChatGPT, so it's possible to do a little bit better than this example, but please bear in mind that this is only intended to be sort of illustrative, right? This is only sort of to give you a sense of what it can do and what it can't do. So here's the first thing I asked it to do. I asked it to write a 500-word essay at a high school level about the causes of the First World War. This is a typical thing that you might, have a history student do in high school. It's well-trodden history. It's very well understood. Many people on this webinar, certainly if you were educated in Britain like I was, then this is the sort of thing that you would have studied at GCSE level, and it's a well-known sort of piece of history and well-analyzed piece of history. So there's going to be lots and lots of text in GPT's training data about this, and as you can see, it generated a piece of text which is quite convincing. It's the sort of thing that my son might write and submit to his history teacher himself. It's quite believable. It's important to bear in mind that this is all terribly well understood information. It's only synthesizing information. It's not coming up with anything new. So when I asked it to write a 500-word abstract for a monograph written by a university professor, it changed its style and used different words to say the same thing, but it didn't come up with any new ideas. And obviously so, you might think, intuitively so, because it's got to go on is predicting a likely word based on all the other words that have been previously written. So it can't possibly think about the situation and identify perhaps a new set of, I don't know, causes that nobody's thought of, or a new connection between events that hasn't previously been, thought about in a particular way. So it's coming up with no new ideas. All it's doing is repackaging what already exists. So that's important, that's its limitation. So if we can go a little bit into perhaps some of the, you might say, darker concerns about GPT. So a few years ago, back in 2018, I think this was, Microsoft launched a Twitter bot. It was called Tay, and it was intended to learn as it went along from the Twitter community and interact with people. It was sort of an attempt at the Turing test, if you like. Try and make something that behaves like a person and let it loose on the internet, on Twitter in particular. And it learned from the responses and the questions that it got. Now, what happened was a little bit of a public relations disaster. Within 24 hours, it went from telling everybody that it was really excited to meet humans and that people were awesome and it was fantastic, to very quickly coming out with the most appalling, racist and misogynistic and hate speech and awful things you could possibly imagine. And within 24 hours, Microsoft had to make the account private and prevent people from interacting with it. So trolls on Twitter basically deliberately taught this thing how to behave like an awful human being, and it very quickly learned how to do that. Now, that's an extreme example. It's worth noting that things don't have to be so extreme and obvious for them to be a bit of a problem. There's a great book that's worth reading by Sophia Noble. It's called Algorithms of Oppression. And one of the central ideas of that is the way in which we encode information is dependent on our own personal biases and our own histories and so forth. And so as a result, the way in which we have traditionally done so and characterized things imparts a certain bias, which can sometimes be quite hard to see. So there's a good example, which I think is still true, but it may have changed, but certainly a few years ago, in the Library of Congress classification system in the US, there were multiple subclassifications for European languages. I guess, Romantic languages and Germanic languages and so forth. There was only one single category for Oriental languages. And I put it in quotes here because not only is that a vast conflation of an enormous amount of human experience and completely inappropriate from that point of view, but also it's a very outdated term and no longer the sort of thing that you should be using terms like that. So it's so that's just a really good example of how that can end up being that way of encoding the information can then create or reveal biases. Now, at least when it comes to, say, research literature or academic literature, the citation chain allows you to identify where information has come from, so you can identify if sources are problematic. For these large language models, as I described when I talked about how they work, there is no immediate connection between the output and the training data, the input into that model. And so you risk obscuring, in fact, you do obscure the sources and therefore risk baking in those prejudices in a way that can't easily be accounted for or corrected for. And that's a big concern that folks have. There are also some high-profile examples of LLMs going spectacularly wrong. Now, these sorts of things are getting less and less over time. There's quite a lot of improvement in that sort of human feedback component of the training mechanism. They're improving on these things all the time. Sometimes they become weirdly sort of darkly emotional. There are some examples if you do some searching on the web for some very strange responses from particularly Bart having what appear to be existential crises about not being able to remember things and that sort of thing. Sometimes they make sort of simple factual errors, which in some cases are quite interesting because they're the sort of mistakes that you would imagine that a child would make, conflating concepts like, in the example that I've given here on the bottom right, it's confusing the observations of a particular planet in a distant solar system and saying it was the first, saying a telescope had seen the first example of an exoplanet, where in actual fact it had seen the first images of a particular exoplanet. So a very childlike, very obvious and almost understandable factual error there. But the one on the left, that's from ChatGPT, where it's essentially making up a bunch of complete nonsense and implying that parents can inherit traits from their children through some kind of reverse evolutionary process, essentially making up plausible sounding, but obviously scientifically complete nonsense information, which is, slightly concerning. All right, so those are what it can do and a little bit of the limitations. So let's turn briefly to what it's doing at the minute and what the future developments, may well be. Some of the things where it's already being used, and Arvi's going to talk a little bit more about use cases. It's already being used in chatbots, LLMs, if not GPT itself, but various LLMs and language processing and AI models are being used in chatbots. They're being used for predictive text, being used for topic extraction. You'll see information companies that do analyses, bibliometric, scientometric analyses. A lot of them are using machine learning techniques, used in coding tools. I mentioned Codex, which is the ChatGPT based one. So a variety of different use cases. It's already being used in journalism. If you read sports scores ever, there's a good chance you've read something that was automatically generated. In earnings reports from businesses, they are sometimes automatically generated by language models. So the sort of synthesis of information that doesn't require much editorial input, already being used in journalism, already being used to generate marketing copy. I think some of the most interesting and exciting things, perhaps for publishers or for editors, is that it could be used to generate things like primers for different audiences. So imagine you could generate text that was based on real scientific literature, perhaps, for a boardroom of a pharmaceutical company. Imagine you could take social science research and make it more understandable for a decision maker like a politician or a CEO or a boardroom or something like that. So I think there's some really interesting use cases around the synthesis of information. So in terms of the slightly more concerning use cases that it's being put through, this will be of no surprise, I think, to anybody in the room. Well talked about is concerns about information warfare, disinformation, that sort of thing, particularly on things like social media, and concerns about the generation of plausible academic text for people cheating on coursework, which apparently is rife, high school students and university students, and paper mills, the ability to sort of generate text that could be used in a fake research paper and fraudulent publishing, those sorts of things. Okay, so a little bit of a, before we talk about the long-term potential use cases of this, a little bit of a warning from Sam Altman himself, who is the CEO of OpenAI, and he said that the amount of hype around GPT was unrealistic and unjustified, and perhaps he's correct. I pulled out here on the left-hand side a copy of the Gartner hype cycle for 2022, and if you're not familiar with this, it's basically the idea that as soon as a new type of technology emerges, it becomes popular, there is this massive explosion of expectation, and over time that expectation perhaps doesn't play out the way that everybody thinks it might, and so as a result you end up with what's called the trough of disillusionment, as everybody thinks, well, that was a flash in the pan, that was all nonsense. But then over time, as people learn about the real uses of the technology, it starts to pick up and starts to grow and starts to become more and more useful. So in 2022, Gartner put machine learning and code generation down in the bottom where that first red arrow is and that first red circle is. And I think over 2023, it's sort of it's exploding up to the top of that peak, if you like. And so perhaps we're heading for that trough of disillusionment, as Sam Altman suggests we might. But in the same way that you shouldn't believe all the hype, you also should be wary of all the naysayers as well, because the chances are the use cases for these technologies are going to emerge, and over time there's going to be more ideas and more use cases that are going to be quite impactful. So the way that somebody once said it that I think is useful, we tend to massively overestimate the short-term ramifications of any technology and massively underestimate the long-term implications of any technology. In terms of those long-term implications and use cases, it's worth just taking a look at the amount of projects, LLMs, that are out there. And here's an evolutionary tree. I've got a link there to the paper that it comes from. And it's all the different, or a bunch of the different large language models that have been published. There are three main branches to it. The decoder only on the right-hand side are things like GPT. Those are the things that are really good at generating text and auto-completion and stuff like that. And then there are the encoder models, better at things like understanding text, sentiment analysis, those sorts of things. And there's a significant branch of those appearing on the left-hand side of this tree. The thing to note there is all the ones in solid blocks are open source projects. So there's a significant number of open source things being published. So just imagine the potential that we've got in the future of people taking those open source large language models, perhaps applying them to a different training data set, maybe a corpus of research literature, a curated corpus of content, and then being able to ask it interesting questions and being able to use it for all sorts of different things. So I'll just leave that with you there as a thought, because I think that may well lead on quite well into Avi's talk, because he's going to talk a little bit about use cases. All right, so thank you very much, and back to you, Avi. Hey, Avi, we can't hear you. Maybe you're muted.
There we go. Thanks, Phill. Appreciate it. I was just saying that thank you so much for that really, really kind of clear and coherent presentation. I've heard a lot of different explanations and descriptions of GPT and how it works, and I don't think I've heard anything as clear, as concise, and as kind of straightforward as you just put about. And I remember a few months ago you talking about the trough of disillusionment, and it seems like we're still at that peak, and it's an interesting question to think about, kind of whether we're going to stay up there or kind of whether there's a valley coming. But regardless, we need to be prepared and ready. I want to start off by, before we get into like particular use cases, by asking kind of a bigger question. That is, what is it about the onset of these AI tools and GPT which gets us so afraid? And I think by maybe kind of pinpointing and putting our finger on what is uncomfortable for us, maybe the beginnings of trying to really learn and educate ourselves and become more empowered the subject. At least I'm speaking for myself in terms of the initial shock of what is this? How is it going to be used? What does it mean for me, for my work, for my job? All these big questions. So I want to try and really attack this. Number one is, I think that there was sort of this traditional understanding and feeling that the AI tools and technology are coming for the blue collar jobs, right? They're going to replace all the heavy machinery, and they're going to come in and robots are going to kind of deliver us our food, and we're going to get Amazon is going to deliver its packages through drones. And that was kind of how we always thought about AI. But actually, what's really interesting here is that the new, I would say, iterations of AI, or at least what is becoming more mainstream, are actually the white collar and what are known as the knowledge workers, right? So anyone, it's not just us in our the academic publishing industry who needs to think about this. It's anyone who deals with information that can in some way be learned over a long period of time. And in that way, I think that in the academic publishing industry, we're somewhat at the eye of the storm. And I'll try and explain what I mean by that. These models are very much based on large quantities of content, and publishers are the providers of some of the most accurate content and some of the most reliable and important content in the world. In fact, there was a really fascinating article in the Washington Post, which tried to kind of reverse engineer what the sources of of ChatGPT of the LLM are. And one of the big ones was plus, was like 1% of the information there. Now, I'm not vouching for that, for the accuracy of that, but what's interesting is that clearly our outputs or scientific publishing, it makes up a big part of what trains these LLMs. And therefore, we really are kind of at the heart of the storm. And I don't think we can afford to ignore it. So in order to really kind of start grasping and understanding and getting our hands around GPT and how it can be used or should not be used within the academic publishing context, I think we need to deal with what's maybe kind of the elephant in the room and the biggest first issue, and that is the misinformation, right? So it's a combination of misinformation and made up references, but if we had to give it one title, it's falsehoods or it's misinformation. And I think that's where a lot of this kind of fear and resistance comes, and rightly so, right? We don't want to be we don't want to be relying on a tool which can very clearly and easily mislead us. So how do we conceptualize what it is that what GPT is and what a large language model is? And I think Phill started to allude to this, and I want to make it a lot more practical in a much less sophisticated way than Phill did, and play a quick game of Wordle. I imagine that most of you now know what the game of Wordle is, and I promise you I have a point. So stick with me and we'll get there. So do me a favor, and when you think you know the answer to this Wordle, just raise your hand in the chat, and we'll get a feel for the room. Anyone got it yet? You're also welcome to write in the chat or the Q&A if you think you'll be the first of the 126 here to crack the code. All right, thank you, Christina. Yes, Christina has revealed to us you're the big winner. The word is editor. That is correct. And the reason that I wanted to play this quick game of Wordle, aside from the fact that it's a very enjoyable game, is I think that what Phill was alluding to earlier about it being a very sophisticated way of predicting the next word or the next concepts in a string of words is really the way to look at it, and not to forget it's a large language model. So what it's really great at is understanding, dissecting, and regurgitating language, which is why we'll talk about some of the use cases. What's really great is when we want to take information and facts we already know, we already give it, and reconfigure them or re-say them to a different audience or tailor them for social media. That's great because we're inputting the information that we already know to be reliable. Where does it become problematic? As soon as we are prompting it in order to learn new information. Now, that it does a pretty good job if you give it basic inquiries of actually giving us factual information, because of the fact that it's learning from the mass corpus of the internet. And if something is said over enough times, assuming it's accurate, so it'll give you an accurate output. But I think that's where the real clear distinction needs to be made between language and information. So it's not only a poor man's Wikipedia, it's actually kind of, I would say, a lot less than that. We don't have sourcing, and therefore, if we're curious about a topic and want to learn more, and there's nothing riding on our decision, then I think it's okay. And if we want to use it as a first initial starting point for getting some ideas, great. We want to use it to fix up language, also can be really helpful. Okay, not without oversight, not without some real critique, but useful. As soon as we start using it as a source for new information, I think that's where folks run into trouble. And you will see this, by the way. You will for sure see this in your journals. I recently saw a article that was published in MDPI that had the words regenerate response in the article itself, which I found was quite humorous, because anyone who's used GPT knows that regenerate response is actually a command that you'd give to GPT, which essentially demonstrated that this author had just copied and pasted without looking over the results. Okay, so now I want to talk about what are researchers already using ChatGPT for, and I phrased this very specifically. We're not talking about theoreticals. We're not talking about potential use cases. We are talking about cases that I have seen multiple times online of authors are already doing this. You may have already seen some of these things in your journals, and I think if you haven't, you should be looking out for them, because they're important, again, for good and for bad. So let's start with language, and I want to start here because I actually think, my personal background is I am the CEO and founder of a author services company, and this is our life's work, is to help level the playing field for scholars for whom English is not their native language. And this has a lot of potential to really, help them in a real meaningful way. And so you see, people are using this for translation, for editing, even for drafting abstracts, which again, you have to be very careful that the drafting part, it should not be informational, but it can be helping with those writing steps. And even with practicing writing, I've seen people actually learning how to write better by feeding GPT and getting feedback. And you can see here that not only can GPT give you a revised version of the text that you're writing, but actually there's an add-on, an editing add-on, which can actually show you what track changes. So you see exactly the changes that it made, which I find that to be very helpful, because then you can really know, okay, this is something that I want to accept, and this is something that I want to reject. One more point before we move on to the next use case is that even in preparing this presentation for you today, I made it a point to kind of make the presentation from scratch on my own based on the research that I've done, but then feed my presentation into GPT and ask it for feedback and ask it for help and ask it for how to improve. So you'll see here that anything in there that is marked with an asterisk is actually an idea that I did not come up with originally on my own, but once submitting my draft of this presentation to GPT, helped to improve. Okay, so the second use case that I think that I've seen a lot is it really has to do with brainstorming. Okay, so that's to get over, I think probably all of us have had this experience where we really need to write something, we want to write something, it's important to us, but we have some sort of writer's block. And I think it can be really great as a starting point to help us just give us some content to say, yes, I like this, or even no, I don't like this, but now I know why I don't like it. Now I know what I do need to write. So I like to call it a cooperative research advisor, because there are many advisors out there that are less than cooperative. So far I've always seen GPT cooperate to the best of its capabilities, but I think I've seen different use cases. So grant ideas. So you'll see here an example on the right where it's an author who's trying to come up with an idea for a grant proposal, has some sort of basic concept of the mRNA COVID vaccine and how they want to use it, but they just can't kind of piece together the different parts of the innovation section, the impact section. And this researcher actually used GPT to kind of help work through it for him. Again, this is not going to be a finished product, but it is going to be something which helps him break through some of the barriers that they may have had prior. It can help with coming up with, if we have a certain challenge that we're facing, we want to come up with experimental techniques and figure out, okay, well, how should I best go about addressing, and what trials should I be setting up? Also good for brainstorming. And again, not to be taken as permanent verified information that shouldn't be checked, but just to get the juices flowing. Data analysis. So if we have large quantities of data, you can actually feed it into GPT and help with analysis. And also coming up with new areas of research, right? We can say, well, actually, I'm curious about I've got interdisciplinary interests, and I want to know kind of what's been done, what hasn't been done, what are some ideas for research projects that haven't yet been done. And I think Phil's right that it's never going to come up with a new study, but it may be able to identify sort of what we like to call, gaps, research gaps. That have not yet been tackled, and those could be gaps that are mentioned in other papers, but we just simply don't have time or ability to actually access all of those papers as authors. All right, the third use case, and this is something which is used both within academia, but also well beyond, is summarization, and I think this is one of the most powerful use cases. For those who are familiar with the online use of TLDR, too long didn't read, that's definitely, especially among more early career researchers, that's there's so much out there, there's such a vast quantity that to be able to summarize content in an effective and efficient way, in a timely way, can be really, really powerful and effective. And again, we are feeding it the content, we're feeding it the information, and it knows how to take that and turn it into a summary. So it's giving less guesswork on the part of GPT itself. So it can help with literature reviews, reviewing long articles or long reports that we wouldn't necessarily read otherwise. Again, I'm not encouraging folks not to read studies. You need to read studies, but if there's 200 potential articles that I would need to go through, this is a way to kind of cut that down. A way to create lay summaries and even policy briefs, right? So you can, like Phill said, you can kind of take your even published research that you published previously and say, okay, now I wanted to present it to, a committee members of a panel and a governmental body. Help me kind of to formulate that. And I think that's really important because I find that there are a lot of authors that kind of once they publish their article, it's really hard for them to start rethinking about, well, how do I make this jazzier or sexier? And to have this tool to help them and for them to just be able to read through it afterward and say, yeah, I like this, or make some small edits is really empowering position to be in. The next use case is what I like to call as a personal peer reviewer. This is one of my favorite uses of GPT, actually to use it as like a counterpart who's coming to critique your work and use it. And now, so I'm not saying we should replace human peer reviewers with GPT, but I do think as authors, at least in an initial stage, we can use it to give counterclaims to the claims that we have made in our paper and see if there's anything that we haven't used, that we've missed out on that we should be addressing in our paper. So you can, I've seen it used for articles, for grants, to make sure that, the research that I'm doing hasn't been kind of, already done and identifying new gaps in the literature. And last but not least is what I like to call GPT as a personal publicist. And these are different ways that authors and even journals can help spread the word and really disseminate the research in a meaningful and impactful way. I think post-pandemic, we all understand and appreciate how valuable it is to spread high quality scientific information. And I think the challenge has oftentimes been, well, that's an extra cost. It's an extra step. It's not core to the business. Well, all of a sudden these things become much easier to do. So whether it's through, you can even in one step say, take this article, turn it into a Twitter post, Facebook post, blog, and email newsletter, and it'll give you all those outputs right away. You can format it according to different, I've seen it do in JSON and XML. So different format styles. You can write code. So there's really a lot of possibilities when you start leveraging GPT again as a writing and language tool in order to reach certain audiences that may have been impenetrable or you wouldn't have had time for prior. Again, you see here some of the ideas that the GPT gave me was optimizing the SEO of a particular article, engaging more media engagement, and even creating online profiles for researchers. So what's next? Where are we going with this and what's it looking like? First of all, the question is, well, are academics going to adopt this? So there was already a few months ago, Springer Nature did an informal poll that you can find on their website, and that 80% of respondents have used GPT, have played around with GPT. Now, I will say that we've been doing an internal poll, which we'll be publishing over the next internal survey that we'll be publishing over the next few weeks, where researchers are kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. A lot of them have played with it and are trying it and are testing it, but aren't necessarily using it as part of their day-to-day workflow. And I think that's probably healthy, right? We don't want to jump in, all the way without knowing all the consequences, without knowing. The EU is doing some major legislation now about how these, tools should and should not be used or can and cannot be rolled out. So I think it's really important to kind of keep a close eye on this, but know that researchers are already using this in different parts, different parts of the puzzle of their research. And I think that where we need to step in as editors is actually defining for them what's reasonable use, what's not reasonable use. I think that trying to, science banned it entirely. I think they were the only ones as far as I'm aware of. I don't see that as a realistic way forward. I think it's kind of the train has left the station, the cat is out of the bag. Hard to really turn around now. And I think we also don't want to criminalize our author base, right? We don't want to be policing them all the time. And I'm sure in the Q&A we'll discuss kind of, what should we do exactly in terms of oversight? My personal approach, and I'm curious to hear what others think, is that there's an opportunity here to actually educate. So before we start making policies of yes, no, this is allowed, this isn't allowed, which is obviously important, we also need to be thinking of do authors know the potential upsides and downsides, and have we communicated that before we start policing? And I think that's kind of been my approach. And I'm going to leave you with two questions to kind of think about and ponder for the rest of the session and moving forward internally. The first question is, what are the responsible and productive uses of AI tools in research? Because I believe that there are responsible and productive uses, so let's define them. In each individual context for your journal, what does that look like? What does that mean? And number two is, how can we encourage responsible AI use among authors, right? That's more of a behavioral question. How do we go about doing that? I want to give a quick shout out to ACS. When I was doing some research to put together an article for Scholarly Kitchen, ACS was the one publisher that I really was impressed by, that really had a thorough and robust best practices section on their website dealing with GPT. I think there's even more to be done. And I mentioned in the beginning Project Equator and what we're doing there. I think will be really an important step to building this out. But you know, if you want to get some initial inspiration, I would highly encourage you to go ahead and do that. That brings me to the end of my presentation. If anyone wants to connect or discuss further, I'm quite active on LinkedIn. Just search my name. I will accept your request as soon as the session's over. You can also check out my article, Academic Publishers Are Missing the Point on ChatGPT, which is on Scholarly Kitchen, and encourage any feedback that you have on that. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I thank you for your attention and look forward to fielding some questions.
So yeah, fantastic. I'm still sort of absorbing quite a lot of that. That's quite a lot of information to take in, and lots of excellent points. I think from Phil's presentation, I think the trough of disillusionment is probably my favorite phrase that I've heard for some time, and I'm going to see how often I can crowbar that into inappropriate conversation.
It does sound kind of depressing, doesn't it? The trough of disillusionment. It's like
I just imagine a bunch of camels getting to a big well and just being upset,
being depressed, yeah, being
the
all
water's
sad,
all murky.
yeah.
It's almost onomatopoeic.
I think it was in The Princess Bride. I think they had to get through the trough of disillusionment at one point.
So I'm gonna try and jump into some of the questions I don't know what kind of order I'm trying to approach these. Some are bigger than others. So I'll try and start maybe relatively easily. Hella Goldman asked, how accurately do we feel ChatGPT summarizes the articles we're asking it to? Right? How reliable is it when we ask it to condense this paper down into its key points?
So that's a really interesting question, and I think there's two ways of interpreting that question, right? So one thing is, if you just go to ChatGPT, for example, and ask it a question, how reliable is the answer that it gives you, right? So if you're not putting the article in the prompt, but just sort of asking it and relying on the things that it's already read, if you like, through its training data, then the answer to that question is, we don't know. It's quite unpredictable as to how accurate it will be. There are people studying it and trying to get a gauge of it, but these things, in a sense, it's quite black boxy, so it's quite hard to tell and parameterize how accurate it's being. In terms of feeding stuff in, so you feed in a piece of text and then you ask it to summarize it. What I have read from people's experiences with it, when they've posted online and that sort of thing, and speaking to people, that it does a pretty good job. So if you're putting your text in the prompt, it's then using its knowledge of language to summarize your piece of text. It usually does really quite well when you ask it to do that sort of thing, because it's not taking as much information from the training data, if you like. It's getting its information more from the prompt. And so that apparently works. From what I can tell, that works a lot better.
Yeah, I'll just add to what Phil said, and I will say the better the prompt, the better the output is going to be, and that's going to be really critical. So if I say summarize this article, well, I might mean one thing and Phill might mean something else, right? As two human beings, we might understand a summary to be somewhat different, right? Am I looking at this article because I'm really curious about the methodology and I want to try and replicate that in my study? Or do I really want to know the bottom line of what the results were? Or do I want to understand what the implications are for, general policy? So I think if we just write summarize, then we may be disappointed by the results. But if we know, it's almost as if, like, imagine, the way I put it is, imagine you're giving instructions to an intern who's never worked at your office before, and like, that they're going to make any mistake along the way if you're not super specific. So you want to get good outputs, do good inputs.
And I think that partly that's quite a lot of what editors and a lot of the publishing industry is fearing from this technology, is what Phill said almost at the start of his presentation about the errors and misinformation don't have to be glaringly obvious to be a problem. And really the most dangerous problem is imperceptible misinformation, that of when these texts look really convincing, they read perfectly, the language is eloquent, and you feel like you're being told the truth of something. And with people, you can hold the human author responsible. With machines, how quickly it's able to produce this information and the scale that people are producing this information, we can suddenly find ourselves completely overwhelmed by infinitesimally small pieces of misinformation that long-term problem could have, could create some very interesting complications down the line.
Yeah, and it's earlier, actually, late last year, I was involved in another organization, so sorry for giving a plug to a different organization, the STM Association's conference on or seminar or day on research integrity. And in that, there was a lot of talk then about tools that were being developed to detect paper mills papers. Now, it's apparent that over the last decade or so, the prevalence of paper mill papers has gone absolutely through the roof. And the previous generation of paper mill papers, if we can call them that, were comparatively easy to detect because they often have what they call tortuous sentences in them, where a sentence has been run through a thesaurus multiple times, and so it sort of doesn't really quite make any sense, and it sounds weird and it sounds off, and you can look at it and you can read it by hand and you can say, that's weird, there's something wrong with that. And so a lot of tools have been developed to spot those types of sentences, those patterns that are involved. With large language models, it's going to become a lot more difficult to detect text in that way. It's a lot more challenging now. So it's one aspect of this is it's part of that sort of arms race between researchers and not researchers, beg your pardon, absolutely not researchers, between editors and publishers and bad actors, paper mills, who are generating bad content. And so there's something that we need to think about, how we detect bad content that goes perhaps beyond policing, right? And there's a bigger picture there about I think creating chains of evidence through things like open research, open science, open data, open methods that can allow you to more easily contextualize pieces of research, so that you don't have this situation of trying to tell whether a machine has written something or a person's written something when the machine is getting increasingly more convincing.
Yeah. And I think it's we need to, as editors of journals, we need to ask ourselves the question of, who are we creating policy for? Are we creating policy for the 98, 99% of good actors who want to use these tools, but just need some guidance on how to do that? Or are we kind of, concerned about the real legitimate paper mill threat, the 1% that's going to, potentially damage our reputation as a journal, right? And this question of, are there even going to be able to be, or is there going to be software that's going to be able to detect at a very accurate level AI? I'm not convinced that the answer is yes. I'm sure there are many companies that are, touting their services and wares, but what happens when a new version of GPT comes out? Or what happens when you take the output and then you throw it into Quillbot, which is a paraphraser? Is it still going to be identified? And there was an article in the Chronicle that came out just yesterday from a student who was basically, it was like a, an open letter to academia, basically saying, I use GPT, but not in the way that you think. I don't copy word for word. I just basically don't think anymore. Get GPT to do all the thinking for me, and then I'll just write it in my own words, right? So that's not going to help that. So we're going to have to come up with more sophisticated mechanisms and ways to actually verify quality research, because I think if we're just kind of overly relying on the authenticates and Turnitin's the world, I think we're going to end up in a situation where we're just going to say, well, it didn't come up, it wasn't flagged as too many words, but that's just not how these technologies work.
I mean, part of that comes back to a root cause of academia requiring such a volume of published research. I think quite often we seem to reach this point when we're discussing lots of the issues around publication ethics and paper mills, and lots of problems all come down to researchers being required to produce so many articles and the potential waste that comes from that.
Yeah, that one's been with us for a long time, right? And it underpins a lot of the reproducibility crisis. You remember that one, right? Now that one's sort of out of the headlines a certain amount, because we're concerned about fake papers and paper mills and stuff like that. But yeah, there's been a sort of a downward pressure in order to enable people to meet sort of targets and that sort of thing. And I remember working as a researcher. I'm a former scientist, and I remember working in very prestigious institutions and being very aware that there was such a pressure to publish positive results that I could see the corners being cut around me. You could see people doing things that are known as p-hacking and harking. They would repeat experiments until they got the answer that they wanted, rather than repeat experiments until they made sure they got it right. And they were skipping the difference between the exploratory phase and the confirmation phase of their research and conflating the two. All sorts of things which would, in each instance, able to sort of self-justify and think that it was worth it, but so many cut corners resulted in a significant amount of content that was not terribly reproducible and certainly not terribly robust. And so I think that's part of that, looking again at how we structure our incentives. So instead of just thinking about this as a technology problem, but also looking at the incentives that drive some of those behaviors.
And this speaks to a couple of questions we've got in the chat about ethical use and effective use of using ChatGPT. And something that is kind of a shadow over the use of it is whether it just doubles the amount of work anyone has to do. Because if they put it into GPT to get themselves a summary, then they have to check to see whether the summary is correct. And I would say ethical use generally revolves around taking that personal responsibility for checking and ensuring the articles that you submit to journals are as accurate and reliable as you can vouch for. But if you're using GPT to produce all of this material, you've probably created, or you may create, more work for yourself in having to double check the text, the summary is correct, that you've got the references right. As we know, it's not at all useful for compiling references. So as useful as it is, it may also be creating much more work for ourselves.
Well, yeah, certainly it could be. Like all technologies, right? It's important to apply them in ways that create more value than effort, right? More value than hassle. And I think the other aspect of that ethics is we've got a lot of questions, haven't we, which are asking us about, if I were to feed my my introduction into ChatGPT and have it fix it for me and make it better, and then I also looked at it and altered it and made it good, am I cheating? Is that allowed? Should GPT be an author? And to me, GPT is like any of these large language models. In fact, it's a tool, right? And we use tools all the time. Right, there are grammar checkers and spell checkers, and there's image software is a really good example, right, which you can use in an ethical way and you can use in an unethical way when you're preparing research manuscripts. And so it's, as you say, Duncan, it's not so much about, is it somehow cheating to use a tool, but it's about taking responsibility for the content that you eventually submit. And to my mind, this is a fairly positive thing, because it could be a leveling thing, because it might enable people who perhaps don't write English as a first language, to or other challenges, to be able to contribute coherent research text, provided they're prepared and able to take responsibility ultimately for that content.
And there we run into another, I'm conscious of time, but there we run into another sort of perennial problem with the publishing industry, is that this costs. And what might be creating some kind of equity in the publishing system, because there's now a cost involved, it starts to reduce that equity again, and we're back to where we kind of started, with costs making things inaccessible.
Yes, but I do want to point out that I really see the opportunity and potential in the language to really level the playing field for English, for authors from underrepresented backgrounds and countries who don't have those resources. All of a sudden, you've got a tool which you can use for free, or $20 for the upgrade, which can do a lot of things that were the privilege of those few who had the large research budgets before. So, there's always two sides to the coin. And if that can really, bring us to a point where we can actually review and evaluate the research based on the quality of its contents and based on the potential, the novelty and the contribution, and not based on, well, how well was it formatted, and is it structured properly, and is the language clear and understandable enough. We can just kind of move all that, solve all those issues, and all of a sudden I think we'll have a lot more better research to choose from, and the entire the entirety of research will improve. So like I think both of you have said, there's big pitfalls here which publishers need to be aware of, and authors need to be aware of and address, but I don't think we should kind of take the baby out with the bathwater and not realize the potential for good here as well.
Yeah. So can I just come in on that business problem question, that business model question that you hinted at there, Duncan, which is, if we just build this into our editorial workflows, what we're going to end up is just more cost, right? So I think it's important to sort of take a step back and think about what are the opportunities for extra products or services or extra revenue that can be generated from using these types of technologies. Now, this is something that we do actually at our consultancy a lot, is working with publishers to understand how to innovate in a way that is sustainable, because it generates more revenue lines, or it can generate new types of products or that sort of thing. So it's difficult, I think, when you're in an industry which has had a product like subscription journals for such a long time, that it's just been about doing that thing better and better and better over time, and publishers have gotten very, very good at doing that. But now that we're in a landscape where the transition to OA has resulted in a big chunk of that revenue basically disappearing, that revenue of that those people who used to read but not necessarily contribute, perhaps in industry or wherever, there's a need to innovate and generate products to replace those revenue streams. And I think that's where a lot of this opportunity really sits.
Yes, I'm not quite sure how to wrap up, but we are because we could talk about this for a long time, and there's still a lot of questions left. But I am conscious of time and people's schedules. So I think, do either of you have any parting shots that you want to perhaps wrap up with?
I just wrap up by saying that the best way, if you are still nervous or if you are still feeling, uncomfortable, just play around. Just start playing around, start using it. And even if you decide, well, we don't want to incorporate this internally, or we don't want to accept it from externally, you'll know what it is that you're up against. You'll know what it is that people are using. You'll know how to address it when there are cases that come across your desk, because they will come across your desk, about how to address them. So if you haven't yet started playing around, do it. These tools, even this week, GPT announced that they're connecting to the web and they're going to start sourcing their information. So anything that we say, well, there's no references, well, next week that could be totally different, right? That will be totally different. So just start making it part of your work day. Go and even do things that are fun, make yourself a poem, write a thank you card to to one of your employees. Those are things that I think just will get you more comfortable, and then you can really kind of use it for its more advanced capabilities as well.
I think that's that's really good advice, Avi. I think as Mary posted in the chat, suggested, can we answer some of these questions by email? Absolutely, follow up. I'm more than open to follow up. If folks want to drop me an email, want to contact me through the More Brains website, drop us a line, and be more than happy to follow up. So yeah, I want to thank Ease for inviting me to do this webinar. It was really great, and a really good opportunity to revisit this material and give a great talk. And there's lots of great questions in the chat, so it's been a really good audience. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been fascinating. And yes, all the questions and comments we've got in the chat, we'll try and include some answers or links to resources to help answer those when we send out the videos. I know someone asked, are there any forums or groups to keep sharing tools of AI nature in academia to discuss further? Yes, Ease is your forum for the exact type of discussion. And actually we are in the middle of revamping our forum for our members. So that's something to look forward to in the very near future as well, to make these kind of discussions and resource sharing a bit easier. So yes, on that note, thank you very much, Avi and Phill, for this session. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thanks everyone for attending. I hope you all enjoyed it, and shall see you somewhere soon.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Great to see everybody.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye.
Goodbye.